forced myself to read a Nicholas Kristof column in the New York Times about the suffering in Gaza. The piece, which had the title, "What Can We Possibly Say to the Children of Gaza?" included interviews with an orthopedic surgeon on the ground there and descriptions of the war that were difficult to read. Maybe some of you read Kristof's column also. It featured the story of a 10-year-old girl who had a scholarship to study in Japan but couldn't leave Gaza and suffered a severe leg injury because of a bomb. I had generally been avoiding images and descriptions of the casualties in Gaza. When disturbing images have popped up on social media or news websites, I've quickly scrolled past them. These images are hard to look at, and I've wanted to protect my own well-being. As I've said in my past Drashot, I don't support the war in this current manifestation. What good does it do to look at descriptions of the horrors? But last week, I decided I've done too much looking away. Sometimes, when we're able to, it's important to wrap one's mind around the extent of the suffering. Especially as Prime Minister Netanyahu said the IDF will ramp up a military assault on Rafah, an area of southern Gaza where 1.4 million civilians are sheltering. It's important to not look away. I won't share more details of Kristof's column with you now, but I think it's important for us to open our eyes to the suffering of the people in Gaza. As we continue to watch what's going on in Gaza, this week's Torah portion, Truma, can help us think through what we as diaspora Jews can do regarding the war. As I mentioned at the beginning of services, in Truma, we read in painstaking detail about the gifts the Israelites are told to bring in order to construct the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold, then insert the poles into the rings on the side walls of the ark for carrying the ark. You shall make cloths of goat's hair for a tent over the tabernacle. Make the cloths 11 in number. A common interpretation of these very specific directions is that it teaches that we can only build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, if everyone contributes gifts to it. The goal of all of these gifts, the goal of building the Mishkan, is to bring God's presence to earth. God says in one of my favorite verses in the Torah that when the tabernacle is built, he says to the people Israel, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Let them build me a mikdash, a tabernacle, so that I may dwell among them. In the year 2024, the gifts we have to offer are quite different from acacia wood, goat's hair, and gold. But the idea still holds. If we, the Jewish people, are to construct anything like a Mishkan, if we are to do our part in repairing the world, if we are to bring God's presence more to earth, then everyone in the Jewish community should contribute something to constructing this metaphorical Mishkan. Perhaps our contribution in this moment as diaspora Jews, our truma, is our ability to speak out for the humanity not just of Jews, but also of Palestinians. If we as a collective Jewish people are to make a contribution to the world, I believe diaspora Jews have an important role to play. How can we think through our role as diaspora Jews vis-a-vis Israel? I want to share with you two insights that came out of the conversation that Rabbi Graf and I had last week with Rabbi Jill Jacobs, the CEO of Torah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, as part of our ongoing series In Focus, Israel and Gaza. The first insight that Rabbi Jacobs offered was that we in the United States should not be afraid to share our opinions on Israel's moral issues. In addition to describing the influence of wealthy right-wing Americans in Israel, Rabbi Jacobs pointed out that moral concerns anywhere in the world are all of our concerns, and she offered the example of Ukraine. I would add that especially since the country of Israel aspires to be a homeland for all Jews, we in the diaspora can try to influence it on critical moral issues. And finally, Israel is conducting the war in Gaza with American financial and military support. We as Americans deserve a say in how our resources are spent. The other point of Rabbi Jacobs that I want to emphasize is about Israeli public opinion. Rabbi Jacobs said that because Israel is justifiably reeling from the horrible, unspeakable attacks of October 7th, the Israeli public generally remains in a state of trauma and shock. Because of this, Rabbi Jacobs says, the mainstream Israeli media doesn't often show images and descriptions of civilian casualties in Gaza. With the remove of an ocean and a continent, we Jews, even here in San Francisco, have a vantage point that gives us a valuable perspective. We can try to influence our loved ones, family members, and fellow Jews in Israel to move the Palestinian issue, the issue of Palestinian human rights, higher on their list of priorities. The unforgiving truth is that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is getting worse, not better, and with an invasion of Rafah looming, yet more suffering could very well be ahead. If we are to play this role, it's important to strengthen our connection with folks in Israel right now. There's a wonderful group of courageous Israeli Jews and Palestinians who have been organizing for months with moral clarity for an unconditional return of the hostages and a military de-escalation. The group Standing Together, which I mentioned in my past Drash show, will be coming to Shereth, Israel on March 12th. The speakers will be the Israeli Jew Alon Lee Green and the Palestinian Israeli citizen Sally Abed, and I really look forward to that event. With the dire consequences of the war getting worse, these organizers can use the support of the Jewish diaspora. In that spirit, it seems that the American Reform Movement could collectively do more to speak out against the war and its current manifestation. Interestingly enough, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, the head of the Masorti movement in Great Britain, the equivalent of the American conservative movement, released a statement this week that I believe offers a model for speaking out and what a Jewish voice that argues for peace can look like. And so I want to share with you now Rabbi Wittenberg's entire statement. He wrote, "These words are written out of deep concern over Israel's potential actions in Rafah, making it impossible to remain silent. The calculated barbarity and strategic cruelty of Hamas's military and the presence of its forces in tunnels beneath Rafah are beyond doubt. It suits them and Iran cynically to provoke Israel in the most appalling ways than to blame it for the awful consequences. But," he writes, "over 1 million Palestinian civilians, many already in flight from the north of Gaza, are now trapped with nowhere to go. In countless references Judaism has, throughout its history, stressed our duty to refugees and the helpless. How can we be unmoved by their grief and unbearable suffering? President Biden has warned that without a credible humanitarian plan to evacuate civilians, attacking Rafah is unconscionable. This must include safe shelter, food, water, and medical aid. Even then, what could the exodus of 1 million hapless people look like? Egypt, while bluntly refusing to accept any Palestinian refugees, has warned Israel of dire consequences, including the possible termination of the peace treaty between the two countries. We all have the fate of the hostages in our hearts, and we saw the joyous pictures of 2 of them who were rescued and reunited with their families a few days ago. But, as thousands of protesting Israelis have said, a major attack on Rafah is unlikely to be the best way to bring the release of many. I write out of horror at what may ensue and its potential consequences in unimaginable suffering. I write out of dread and the future hatred that this is likely to engender, and out of fear that these actions may haunt us and the good name of Israel and the Jewish people for generations. I write in prayer that another political path forward will be forged, and that the God of Israel and all humanity will help us to find a way to peaceful resolution, with security for Israel and a viable future for the civilian population of Gaza, without any more appalling bloodshed. Rabbi Wittenberg wrote that from the perspective of the Masorti, or what we would call the conservative movement. I believe our Reformed tradition also has a lot to offer in this moment. The Reform movement, which began in Germany in the 19th century, has always prioritized the Jewish people's ethical responsibilities. In my past drashot, I've quoted Rabbi Leo Beck, the head of the Reformed Jewish community of Berlin before and during the Holocaust. Beck was so taken by the idea of the Jewish people's ethical purpose that he wrote parts of his magnum opus while imprisoned in a concentration camp. And these are some of the words he wrote. Everywhere and always, Jews have known themselves to be addressed and touched. Everywhere an answer is demanded from them. Everywhere the commandment to be ethical reveals itself. This commitment to our ethical concerns is one of the great gifts of the Reformed tradition. Like our forebears who brought their gifts, their truma, to the Mishkan to bring God's presence to earth, it's time for us to apply our movement's great insight about our moral purpose to the present situation. Then we pray the Jewish people will collectively work toward a Mishkan. Then we pray we'll see more of God's presence in the world. Then we pray we'll move closer to peace. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.